The Arizona sun hung like a molten coin in the bleached sky, pouring heat onto the weary town of Redemption Creek. Even the wind had given up, leaving only the steady hum of flies and the creak of a sign above the general store. Beneath that sign stood Theodore Morgan, rolling a cigarette between scarred fingers, his gray eyes hidden beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He was a man used to silence, used to carrying ghosts that never left him alone. Across the street, a crowd had gathered near the old auction block, a place meant for horses or tools, not people. Yet the noise that rose from the onlookers carried a cruel excitement, the kind that made Theodore's stomach turn. He had fought in a war that was supposed to end men treating others as property, and now here it was again, dressed up as justice. "Step right up, gentlemen," called Cornelius Pike, the greasy-haired auctioneer. "A special case today. A lady in need of discipline and a decent man's supervision." Theodore's jaw tightened. He didn't want to look, but he did. A woman was pushed onto the platform. Her wrists were bound, her dress torn at the hem, dust clinging to the blue fabric. A strip of dark cloth hid the lower half of her face, but her eyes, Lord, those eyes, green as sage after rain, fierce and unbroken. "Found guilty of improper conduct at the Silverton boarding house," Pike announced. Judge figured she'd do better under honest care than behind bars. "Bidding starts at $5. Theodore felt the old ache in his shoulder, the place where a Confederate musket ball still whispered pain when something was wrong. The crowd shifted, hungry. "5!" shouted Jake Cutter, a bounty hunter Theodore knew too well. Mean, cruel, always chasing trouble. "I could use some company on the trail." Laughter followed, sharp as glass. "7!" came another voice. "10!" Cutter again, grinning like a wolf. The woman didn't flinch. She stood straight, rope cutting into her skin, eyes daring anyone to come closer. And then, for one breathless moment, her gaze met Theodore's. Something passed between them. Recognition, faint but certain. A memory stirred. A blizzard in the Colorado mountains, a hand pulling him from beneath a fallen horse, green eyes above a scarf. "Going once at 10, Pike shouted. Theodore stepped forward. 50 cents! The crowd erupted in disbelief. "Sir," Pike stammered, "bid's $10. "I said 50 cents. Theodore's tone was quiet, deadly calm. His hand rested on the butt of his Colt, and everyone knew better than to test a man like him. The coins rang against the wooden platform. "Unless Mr. Cutter wants to talk about those wanted posters in Tucson," Theodore added, with a face mighty similar to his. Cutter's hand twitched toward his gun, then dropped. "This ain't over, Morgan. I never said it was." "Sold!" Pike croaked, sweat rolling down his neck. "To Mr. Morgan, for 50 cents. Theodore walked to the platform. Up close, the woman looked both defiant and exhausted. He cut her ropes with his knife. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Better than you," she answered, her voice muffled by the cloth. A spark flickered in her eyes. Pride, maybe gratitude, maybe challenge. They mounted the waiting horses. The crowd parted, muttering. Only Mrs. Polson, the minister's wife, called out softly, "Grace!" "I tried to help." The woman turned her head. "Grace died in that boarding house. My name is Eleanor now." And just like that, she left her past behind in the dust. They rode west as the sun bled toward the mountains, the silence between them thick with questions neither dared to ask. When the town was a smudge behind them, Theodore finally said, "You'll be safe at my place up in the pines. Day's ride from here." "Safe?" Eleanor echoed. "What's the price of that safety?" "No price. I don't buy people." "Then why?" she asked. He touched his shoulder, feeling the old wound burn. "Because I owe a debt. To a woman with green eyes who once dragged me out of a storm." The trail climbed into cooler air, pine trees replacing dust. They rode until the stars spilled across the sky like frost. When they stopped to make camp, Eleanor helped gather wood, her movements wary but strong. The firelight turned her eyes to emerald fire. "You don't remember me," she said quietly. "I'm starting to," Theodore replied. He told her of the avalanche, of the woman who'd refused to leave him for dead. She nodded. "That was me, back when I still believed good deeds came back around." "They do," he said softly. "Maybe just later than we hope." Eleanor looked at him across the flames. "The man I killed, Prescott, he didn't believe women had choices. I proved him wrong, but it cost me everything." "You survived," Theodore said. "That counts for something." They sat in silence for a long time, the desert wind whispering through the cottonwoods. Somewhere a coyote cried, lonely and distant. Eleanor pulled her blanket around her shoulders. "I can work," she said finally. "Cook, mend, help with stock. I won't be a burden. Never said you would be." Her eyes softened. "Then I'll stay, until I find where I belong." Theodore nodded. "You might already be closer than you think." As the fire burned low, he watched her drift to sleep beneath the stars. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace settle over him, a fragile, uncertain peace, but real. The woman who'd once saved his life now needed saving of her own, though she didn't know it yet. And maybe, in helping her, he could finally save himself. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. The night wrapped around them, two broken souls, alone together on the edge of the world. And somewhere in that quiet wilderness, the story of Theodore Morgan and Eleanor Crowe truly began. By the time the cabin appeared through the tall ponderosa pines, the sun had begun its slow descent. The air smelled of sap and clean earth, and the steady hum of cicadas filled the forest like a heartbeat. For 2 days they had ridden hard, following hidden trails and dry creek beds to avoid the bounty hunter Theodore knew would come after them. The mountain air was thinner, but it tasted like freedom. "It's not much," Theodore said as they reached the clearing, dismounting from his bay gelding. "But it's solid." Eleanor looked around in quiet wonder. The cabin was made of thick pine logs, smoke rising gently from the chimney. A corral stood nearby, along with a well and a small garden overgrown with weeds. It wasn't grand, but it looked safe, a place untouched by the noise of men. "It's perfect," she said softly. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean. A table with 2 chairs stood near the fireplace, and shelves lined with tools and tin dishes told of a man who lived by his hands. A single quilt hung neatly over the bed in the adjoining room. "You take the bedroom," Theodore said before she could protest. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I couldn't." He cut her off with a small shake of his head. "Not up for debate." She hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." For the first few days, they settled into an unspoken rhythm. Theodore would rise before dawn to check the cattle or split wood. Eleanor kept busy in the cabin, cleaning, mending, and cooking. They didn't speak much, but a quiet understanding grew between them. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her as she worked, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Sometimes she'd steal glances at him when he wasn't looking, the way his broad shoulders moved when he swung an axe, or how his expression softened when he fed the horses. It wasn't comfort yet, but it was something close. One morning, while Eleanor was hanging laundry, she heard the distant sound of hooves. Her heart lurched. Theodore stepped out of the barn, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he said quietly. 3 men rode into view. Neighbors, Theodore later told her, the Dalton brothers. Their leader, Samuel Dalton, raised a hand in greeting. "Heard you brought home a woman, Morgan." Theodore's jaw tightened. "A guest," he replied evenly. "She's under my protection." Andrew Dalton, the middle brother, smirked. "A guest who wears a mask? Must be a story there." Eleanor's spine stiffened. She stood on the porch, silent, her face hidden behind the dark cloth. "Miss Crowe's had trouble in town," Theodore said firmly. "She's staying here while things settle. That's all anyone needs to know." The brothers exchanged glances. Samuel finally nodded. "No issue here. Just making sure you ain't harboring trouble." I'll handle my own trouble, Theodore said. Samuel tipped his hat. Fair enough. Welcome to the mountain, ma'am. As they rode away, Eleanor realized her hands were trembling. Theodore noticed. They won't bother you, he said. Dalton's a decent man, got daughters of his own. Still, that night she slept lightly, one hand near the small knife under her pillow. Days passed. The mountains began to show the first hints of autumn gold. Eleanor threw herself into work, tending the garden, mending clothes, baking bread. Labor steadied her hands when her thoughts grew too heavy. Yet the silence between them grew less sharp, replaced by something warmer. One evening, Theodore came in from the barn carrying a small wooden box. Thought you might like something to do in the evenings, he said, placing it on the table. Eleanor opened it to find books. Worn, faded, but precious. My wife was a reader, he explained. Said a house without books was a soul without air. Eleanor ran her fingers over the cover of a volume of poetry. She was right, she said softly. Theodore hesitated, then asked, Would you read aloud? Haven't heard another voice in this place for a long time. She smiled behind her mask. I'd like that. That night, her voice filled the cabin, calm and measured, reading lines about courage and forgiveness. Theodore sat by the fire, mending tack, though his hands stilled more than once as he listened. When she finished, he said quietly, You read like someone who understands loss. She looked at him over the flames. I suppose we both do. The first snow came sooner than either expected. It dusted the ground like fine sugar, turning the pines silver. The cold crept in through the logs, and Eleanor awoke one night shivering. She wrapped herself in every blanket she could find, but the chill wouldn't leave. Finally, she crept into the main room. Theodore was awake, feeding the fire. Couldn't sleep? He asked, glancing up. It's freezing, she admitted through chattering teeth. Without a word, he motioned her closer. He pulled a thick buffalo robe from a trunk and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth and the smell of wood smoke surrounded her like safety itself. Thank you, she said quietly. First rule of mountain living, Theodore said, smiling faintly. Never be too proud to admit you're cold. For a while they sat together in silence, watching the fire. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, but inside there was peace. The kind that comes only when two people have survived enough storms to recognize one another's strength. After a moment, Eleanor asked softly, Why 2 chairs at your table if you live alone? He stared into the fire for a long time before answering. Habit, he said finally. I keep thinking she'll walk through that door again, angry at me for burning the biscuits or forgetting to wipe my boots. Eleanor's heart softened. You loved her. I did, Theodore said. Still do, in a way. But grief changes, like seasons. You just learn to carry it. She nodded. Maybe some things aren't meant to be forgotten. Just lived with. Quote. When she looked up, his gray eyes were on her. There was no pity there, only quiet understanding, one broken soul recognizing another. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the world in white silence. Inside, 2 people who had learned to survive alone sat by the fire, beginning to remember what it felt like to simply live. The blizzard came fast and mean. By afternoon, the sky over the pines had turned the color of pewter. The wind began to howl through the branches, driving curtains of white that swallowed the trail, the corral, and the world beyond. Theodore had seen plenty of storms in his years, but this one felt different, angry, determined. Storms rolling in quick, he said, stamping snow from his boots. We'll need to bring the stock in. I'll help, Eleanor replied, already pulling on her coat. He hesitated. No, it's too dangerous out there. Theodore Morgan, she interrupted, her green eyes flashing. I grew up in Minnesota. I know a real winter. I'm coming. Something like admiration flickered across his face. Then grab the rope from the porch. We'll tie it between the house and barn so we don't lose our way. They fought the storm together, wind clawing at their faces, snow biting their skin. The horses screamed in fear when the door flew open, and it took both of them to calm the frightened animals and fill their troughs with water. The barn lantern swung wildly, throwing their shadows across the hay-strewn floor. "The cattle will find shelter in the grove," Theodore shouted over the roar of the wind. "Come on, we need to get inside." By the time they stumbled through the cabin door, both were coated in white. Eleanor's mask had frozen stiff, crusted with ice. She tried to untie it, but the fabric clung painfully to her cheek. "It's stuck," she gasped, frustration cracking her voice. "Hold still," Theodore said, bringing a bowl of warm water. He knelt before her, wringing out a cloth, carefully melting the ice away. His touch was slow and gentle, his rough hands moving as if she might break. "Almost there," he murmured, "just a little longer." The mask came free with a soft tear of frozen fabric. Eleanor reached up instinctively to cover her face, but Theodore had already turned away, giving her the dignity of choice. "I'll fetch you another," she whispered. He stayed where he was, staring into the fire. "You don't have to. Not here. Not with me." Silence fell between them, thick and trembling. Outside, the storm battered the roof like fists. Inside, another storm gathered, quieter, deeper. Eleanor's voice was barely a breath. "You don't understand." "Then help me," he said gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She hesitated, then lowered her trembling hand from her face. "My name wasn't always Eleanor Crow," she began. "It was Grace Fletcher back before Silverton." Theodore didn't move, but she could feel his attention like warmth. "I went west to start over, found work at a boarding house, honest work, until Hamilton Prescott came along." She paused, the name tasting like ash. He was powerful. Used to getting what he wanted. When I refused him, Her hand brushed the scar that ran from temple to jaw. "He tried to take it anyway." Quote. The words spilled out with the force of years held silent. She told him about the fight, the fall, the sickening crack of Prescott's neck, and the trial that followed. How his family bought the judge. How her face became proof of guilt. How she was given a choice between prison or being sold into protection. When she finished, the storm outside was a muffled roar, the fire burning low. Theodore turned at last. His eyes were steady, his voice quiet, but fierce. "Show me." Eleanor hesitated, heart pounding, then lifted her chin. The scar gleamed faintly in the firelight, raw, uneven, but healed. She braced herself for pity or revulsion. She found neither. Theodore crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "Eleanor Crow," he said softly, "you're the bravest woman I've ever met." "Don't say that," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You don't know what I've done, what I carry." "I know exactly what you carry," he said, "and I see what it means. You fought. You survived. That's what this scar says to me." His hand rose, slow enough that she could have stopped him, but she didn't. His calloused fingers traced the mark on her face, not as a flaw, but as something sacred. "This," he murmured, "is proof of strength." Eleanor let out a choked sob. Months of buried pain came pouring out. Every fear, every shame. Theodore held her through it, steady as stone. "I see him every time I look in the mirror," she whispered. "Then we'll change what you see," he said. "You'll look and remember that you lived, and he didn't." When she finally lifted her head, the tears on her face sparkled in the firelight. "How can you look at me and not see what I've lost?" "Because I see what you've found," he said simply. "Your courage, your fire, the woman who pulled me out of a blizzard and made me want to live again." Something in her broke and healed at once. She reached for his hand and pressed it to her scar. "Then touch me there," she said quietly. "Not out of pity, but because I'm not hiding anymore." His thumb brushed her cheek, light, reverent. His voice came low, rough with emotion. "Careful, angel. Once I'm yours, I stay forever." Quote. She smiled through her tears. "I'm counting on it." The wind screamed outside, but in the small cabin the world was still. Two wounded hearts had stopped running, from pain, from ghosts, from themselves. They stood together before the fire, not as savior and saved, but as equals, both scarred, both whole, both learning what it meant to be seen and not turn away. When dawn broke, The storm had passed. The world outside lay clean and white, unmarked and new. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the cold biting her cheeks, and lifted her face to the rising sun. Theodore joined her, silent, his hand finding hers. They stood that way for a long time, two figures carved against the light, ready to face whatever came next. The past would always whisper, but now it no longer ruled them. They had built something stronger, born of fire, frost, and the quiet miracle of being loved exactly as they were.